The KRC Farm and Food Conference was held on November 16th and 17th in Wichita, Kansas. The theme was Framing Our Future. What is right about food, farming, and communities in Kansas? I would like to introduce Friday keynote speaker Mary Hendrickson, Rural Sociology Associate Professor, University of Missouri, and contributor to Harvesting Opportunity, the Power of Regional Food System Investments to Transform Communities. Her topic is Growing Community with Local and Regional Food Systems.
Thank you, and it's really fun to be back here in Kansas. Paul Johnson was pointing out that I haven't come to Kansas for a while, and I said I've been here like 2 or 3 times this year. So I was in Lawrence with Marlon and folks, and of course I grew up, many of you may know this, but I grew up in a little town called Shickley, Nebraska. You'll see a couple of pictures on this, but anybody that's here from Belleville will probably recognize that town. And I'm very close. I went to school with Keith Burns, who's one of your sponsors of Green Cover Seeds. So I have my roots here on the prairie, and I grew up in a town of 341 people, and I did talk to Corey Brown for about an hour and 15 minutes. Yes, a lot of us did. And, she was pretty focused on, oh my God, look at this terrible disaster. And I'm like, look, people are still happy and living in these communities, and there's a lot of things going on. So I think I've got about 35 to 45 minutes, we'll see. So I want a lot of discussion and questions, and you're welcome to interrupt me and ask me a question as we go along. And I think we have about an hour for this session, so I hope that we have quite a bit of good discussion towards the end, if anything sparks your interest. So the way I've broken this up is I'm going to talk a lot about like the way the food system is changing, and as Mary said, I do have my sad hat some days when I look at consolidation. It's not a pretty picture. I'm not going to talk about that today. You can ask me questions about it if you want, but that's not the whole story of the food system. And there's a lot of really interesting things going on. So I'm going to talk about how the food system is changing. And then I'm going to talk about how are we going to capture those benefits back home. And how are we going to measure those benefits back home. And those are really important things that I want to spend more of the time on. So let's see if I can get my mouse to work. Yes. Okay. So, you guys can't see that. I was thinking you could. Sorry about that. But basically what this is just growth in organic food. And most of you guys know what's going on in the organic arena. But we've had pretty stellar growth. We're up to 5% of the overall food market is organic now, which is pretty good, actually. And there's a lot of things that are driving this kind of interest in the food system. It's a very dynamic and evolving system. The food businesses themselves have a hard time keeping on top of it. And this is because people who eat, like all of us, right? But people who eat are driving lots of changes in the food system. They're worried about quality. They're worried about food safety. They're worried about transparency and trust. And in fact, the food system is not a very trusted place to be, especially if you're a very large operator today, because people have a lot of perceptions of how you're treating the land, how you're treating workers, and actually treatment of workers is starting to inch up as a pretty important aspect of what people are looking for in their food. And the whole food market is changing too because of millennials. And as my niece, who is a millennial, says, yeah, we've killed everything. She posted something on Instagram about all the things that millennials have supposedly killed. And one of them is supermarkets. In terms of the traditional supermarket is very different today. There's a lot more opportunity for people to find different kinds of market channels for for their food. So these things are really important. Millennials are driving the natural and organic food market. Now, we can quibble a lot about the different kinds of labels, and I know natural will drive any of you organic producers in the audience absolutely nuts, because it doesn't really mean much. But what it does suggest is that people are looking for something different. And most of the time, consumers can't really unravel what they're looking for. They're looking for a relationship. They're looking for something that is about environmental values, but it's also about social values. So it gets lumped for industry terms in this natural category, sort of. And who's driving it? Millennials, families. So people shopping with thinking about their children. Gen Xers, my generation, is still doing their part here. And then, families with children are the big driver, because people are very, very worried about what they're feeding their kids. And there's a dark side of this, because now we're like, Mom, you can't feed your kid that, right? I mean, that just puts guilt on moms. So I'm a little careful with that. But it's still a really important driver here. And so this came out of a food industry report in 2017 or 2016, I think. And Deb Trop from the USDA has put together a lot of this, pulled together this information. You can also see what this means is that when you look at where people are shopping, so the blue is farmers markets, the green is value retailers. What's a value retailer? Walmart? Aldi's a big one. And Aldi's actually has quite a bit of organic stuff, and Aldi's does more more Midwestern production than I think a lot of people realize, which is a very interesting place. But those value retailers, now, this is millennials, this is younger millennials, older millennials, this is Gen X, and this is boomers. And if you want to know what millennials are, 1981 to 1997 is the year they were born, okay? So you can see that they are abandoning traditional retailers, so that's putting a lot of pressure on supermarkets to kind of change around. And they're going into, Walmart is a mass retailer, value retailer like Aldi's, and they're going to natural retailers here too. So what we're seeing here is that, according to the Organic Trade Association, the millennial consumer is changing the landscape of our food industry. They're more aware of the benefits of organic. They place a greater value on knowing how their food was grown and produced, and they're deeply committed to supporting a food system that sustains and nurtures the environment. So these things all ring true to me, and it rings true to me for Kansas millennials and Missouri millennials, like it does for California ones. So I think that there's a lot of things happening in the food system. It's a very dynamic place to be. Farmers are responding. So USDA has been slow to track this stuff, but then they really got their act together and did this. So they did a local food marketing practices survey in 2015. $8.7 billion in sales across the nation in what they defined as local regional foods. Now, I'm going to spend a whole bunch of time talking about local foods, and you will notice I'm never going to define it. What does local mean? What?
Local.
Local means local, but what's that mean?
USDA says 400 miles.
So USDA says 400 miles. Are you willing to accept that?
No.
No. Okay, what is local?
150.
100 miles. 50 miles. It means what you want it to mean. Okay?
It means you know the source.
Know the source. Anybody else? So, I heard a lot of proximity or geographical kinds of definitions. Then I heard over here, know the source. Why does the source matter?
It's important to
be a millennial. Trust and transparency. No, I'm just. I'm teasing. But no, trust and transparency are a big part of that. So when you think about local, I did a bunch of focus groups in Missouri and Nebraska, in rural areas as well as in Kansas City and in Omaha. And what was really fascinating about this is in rural areas, it was about geography. And the reason I asked you if you were from a rural area is because rural consumers generally had a more limited geography. They were local for them was closer, maybe the county, maybe 50 miles, or I think the average was like 55 miles or something like that. And people that were closer to cities or in cities were, longer range, maybe a couple hundred miles. But tied up with that was not just knowing the source, how it was produced, so it mattered how it was produced. But what really mattered was that it wasn't corporate. So when people said, well, you say local, but Tyson could be right here, with their chicken plant, and I don't think that's local. So people differentiated from that, and that corporate identity was really like, that's not local. So it's proximity, except it has to be, producers that people are kind of thinking about who embrace community values or who are thinking about environmental issues as well. So this is it's a fluid definition. I like the woman who said it means what you want it to mean, and this is why we have a problem with labeling. This is why we have a problem with people co-opting local. There's a lot of different things about that. Okay, but local food systems are local and regional. A lot of people in the Northeast want to talk about regional. That's what we're going to focus in on, and I'll have another little definition a little bit later on. But the USDA really thinks about it as kind of a regional focus. They're interested in more of a short supply chain, so they're kind of thinking about, it doesn't change very many hands, those kinds of things. So when they're talking about intermediated marketing, they're talking about, maybe some farmers that are cooperating together, who maybe have what USDA loves to call a food hub, but an aggregation distribution point. Though that sells into a school lunch program or something like that. But $8.7 billion is moving through these channels. The largest segment is farms that are selling food to institutions or intermediaries. And so I think there's a farm to school session later on. This is happening across the board. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And direct to consumer, which is, just farmers who are selling at farmers markets, community support agriculture, things like on-farm sales, internet, stuff like that. So that's about 115,000 farms across the country, $3.3 billion. And this is up from 2007 data, but the number of farms is down a little bit. There's some indication that farms that are selling into local markets, either direct or intermediated, are a little bit more successful, or they stay around longer. So they may not have great finances when we look at them, but they do stay around longer. They don't have, and that's based on some data from Steve Vogel at the USDA. Okay. So the other thing is that they're more profitable, perhaps, for farmers to go through wholesale channels. Some of that is economies of scale, some of that is specialization and things like that. But this is based on the USDA's survey that about a third of the, or over half of the market is really by farms that use exclusively wholesale marketing channels. So that's pretty interesting. So we'll see a lot of our agriculture in the middle farms, so farms that are maybe a little too large to do farmers markets, because frankly, while I love the farmers market, and I won't be there tomorrow, but I love the farmers market. I'm there when it's cold, I'm there when it rains. It's not the most efficient kind of place, right? It's only open 4 hours a week in Columbia. I mean, it's open on Wednesdays too, but nobody goes then. It's open 4 hours a week. And while farmers can get, better, prices there, the problem, of course, is I was out there with my umbrella, pouring rain one morning, and just looking at this very sad faces of farmers because they know what that rain means, and so on. So their farmers markets are great, but sometimes the wholesale markets can provide you a little bit more stability. There's some economies of scale, some efficiencies. So that's why there might be a little bit more profitable. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this, I pulled this data off the National Farm to School Network, and 42% of schools in the United States are participating in a farm to school program, and so they're getting, I think they have $789 million, and I'm not sure exactly if that's cumulative or what's going on there, but that's really important data, and things like farm to school can be, I think, a driver, particularly in rural areas, can be a driver to help us jumpstart some of the local food economy. So what I've briefly covered here is the food system's changing. Now, as many of you know, I worked a long time with Diana Endicott and with Ball's Foods in Kansas City. Nobody's ever perfect, but they have done some pretty amazing things, I think, there. And one of the latest innovations is using the SNAP Double Up Bucks program in the grocery store as well, to really help lower income folks access this good food. And they've been a really interesting player. That small supermarket chain, because they're family-based, they're based in Kansas City. They're not really expanding any further. So I think that they've been a really interesting kind of leader in the supermarket arena. So the food system is changing. Now the question is, are we capturing the benefits as eaters, as farmers, as communities? And this is what I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about, because this change is important, but only if it works for us. And only if it doesn't get captured by corporate. And I'm not against business, by the way. We'll talk about that. But I am against market power. And so when we think about these emerging systems and dynamic systems, we got to think about what we want and how we want it to look and how we can capture the benefits. So I want to talk a little bit about a community food system, because and you can kind of expand this up to a regional level, and actually regional food systems might work better on the plains. I would say in my hometown, 341 people, Shickley, Nebraska, I would say there's probably 10% of the people in that town that are pretty concerned about food and interested in buying different kinds of food. And that's great. What's 10% of 341 people? Now, I live in a town of 115,000. And I would say about 10% of the people are interested, right, in buying food that supports ecology and so on, maybe more, but it's always hovered around 1.5 million, right, roughly. So I think that KC's metro area is now at about 2.1 million. And Nebraska is considerably bigger, as is Kansas, than just that metro area. And so you have a lot of space. And sometimes that space or that distance can create some, people might look at community food systems out in western Kansas and say, I can't do that, Mary. But that's not my point. My point is that community food systems have different goals. They have different goals than a food system that is organized by corporations. So what is the food system goal if you're going to organize it by corporations? Profit. And they better damn well make money. What happens if a company doesn't make money? If they're listed on any of the stock exchanges? What happens? What?
They go out of business.
They go out of business, perhaps. They lose money. But shareholders can hold them responsible for not making money. And by the way, any of you who have pension plans at all, and I know there's very few of us anymore that do have pension plans, but anybody who has a pension plan in here, you're a shareholder. So when we think about food systems that are organized within the marketplace only, the idea is about profit. Now, profit can do a lot of things. That's a good thing. But when we're thinking about community food systems, we're thinking about food systems that are organized in a different way. They have different goals. Community food systems are place-based, so that can mean Western Kansas, right? It doesn't have to mean one county. It's place-based. It's an integrated system. The food production, processing, distribution, consumption, and waste, because food waste is a huge deal, are integrated to enhance the environmental, the economic, the social, and nutritional health of that place. Now that's different. That's got goals. We're talking about ecology, we're talking about community, we're talking about people in that, as well as thinking about environmental or economic issues, right? And I can't frankly say I've seen the perfect community food system. I haven't. We got a pretty strong, healthy one in Columbia. That's pretty cool. Vermont looks like Mecca to some of us, right? Except it's cold. But anyway, it's pretty amazing what they're doing up there. But the point of community food systems are that they're about where you are. They're about your place and how you're going to improve your place. And you got to think about it. It's not just farming, it's distribution, it's processing. How are we going to capture that? I heard, I'm blanking on her name, the woman who does the poultry processing, that was at harvesting. Yeah, amazing stuff. Amazing stuff that's going on. But that's really important because that's a hang up. And after I had to butcher one of my turkeys that got hit on the road, which I haven't butchered fowl since I was a little kid, I love processing plants. Just as an aside, I've never had turkeys before. I never had them as a kid. And I really did not like chickens when I was a kid. I thought, oh my God, they're not for me. We got turkeys this year to supplement our chicken flock. And wow, they are amazing animals. They're almost like puppy dogs. So I'm going to have a hard time in December, as you can tell. So community food systems are what I'm wanting to talk about here, but think about them as place-based systems that embody goals, particular kinds of goals, and we strive towards them. So, when we think about community food systems, then we're thinking about how we're going to integrate all of this stuff, right? And the best thing, I've been working in food systems, community food systems for 20 years now. The best thing is the people. It's about the relationships. And it's about how those relationships form, and that makes everything work in the network. But it takes a lot of knowledge. So Mary said you were working on some of the nuts and bolts stuff. That's important. We need new knowledge. We are finding out so much stuff about soil health right now that's absolutely critical to really farming in the future. I've never seen something so innovative as what's happening in local food systems. Even the people in my division who are agricultural economists think that they're innovative. That's great. they're like, wow, people are doing all this cool stuff. And I'm like, yeah, right. And they're about fun. And I think that's important because, you know, it's not that fun to go to a grocery store and just shop for brands, but it's really fun to go look at local food in a different way, go to a farmer's market, go to a natural food store that has stories about everybody. And it's fun for farmers to know who's going to eat their food. So when we think about these community food systems, we're thinking about the networks. And we're thinking about the relationships, the knowledge, the innovation that flows through those networks. One of the things that I found from farmers in Missouri and Nebraska, they're really interested in producing for the local food market. These farmers mirrored what happens with USDA farmers. About half of them sold exclusively through farmers markets. The rest of them sold through a variety of market channels, but they were all motivated by things that aren't profit oriented only, right? So they were producing food for their local market, provides an additional level of pride in my product, provides an additional level of satisfaction. It contributes to the quality of life in my community. It provides a little extra additional income. And it provides an added level of independence for agriculture producers, perhaps. So there's a lot of different reasons why people are participating in these food systems. Now, Corey Brown wanted to talk about this kind of stuff, right? So when we look at the red is where we have higher, the red and dark red is where we have higher percentage of farms doing direct sales of local food. And the blue and green counties, especially the green counties are the most rural counties based on kind of a classification system called the rural-urban continuum. So, you know, it's the plains, right? Those are the most rural counties. So you can see that the red doesn't always overlap with the blue and green. What this suggests is, and this is based on 2012, so it's a little old, but this suggests that rural areas can't capture, the really remote rural areas like where I grew up or here in Kansas can't capture these markets. And I don't think that's true. But it is something that we have to contend with, and we have to think perhaps differently. This is like direct marketing, okay? So, yeah, direct marketing is harder in larger spaces. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but it might happen in a different way. It might take different kinds of arrangements and innovation. But I put this up here just to remind us, you know, we have to think creatively. We have to think about things a little different. Now, here's the, by the way, that's my little town, Shigley. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I just want you to write down on your sheet of paper or a conference program or something, what's the best thing about living in your community? Write it down. Make sure you got the best thing about living in your community written down. Then I also want you to just like maybe a word or phrase, what makes your community livable? That's a hard question, so however you put it down.
Potential.
Potential. We're going to have Cher just a minute. That's perfect. All right. Everybody's got those two answers down? Okay. Over here. What do you like best about living in your community?
The people.
The people. Anybody else over here?
Community engagement. People are engaged in the community.
People are engaged in the community. Okay, over here. What makes the best about living in your community? What do you like best?
Dedication to quality of life.
Dedication to quality of life. Anybody else? Over here. What do you like best about living in your community? Diversity. Diversity. Anybody else? What do you like best? What do you like best about living in your community?
My family's there.
Your family's there. Back there. Right behind the post. What do you guys like best about living in your community? Come on, anybody, just yell it out. You help each other out. All right. Did anybody hear dollars?
Nope.
You heard people, relationships, family, diversity. I didn't hear natural amenities because I asked you what you like best, and probably the second thing will be you like the place you live. What makes your community livable? Potential. Potential. What makes your community livable?
Accessibility.
Accessibility. What do you mean by that?
You can easily get what you need or want.
Okay, you can walk uptown 3 blocks, right? Or something like that. Accessibility. What makes your community livable?
Variety.
Variety. So I like this diversity and variety. What?
Where do they live?
Come on, diversity and variety comes in many forms, right? So diversity can be young versus old, right? You just like really light up when you see some kids playing around or something like that. So it's young versus old. It can be about women and men. It can be immigrants and long-time people that live there. So there's diversity in rural communities. In fact, a lot of people think that there isn't, and there is. But we have to think about what it is. How do we measure it? What kinds of diversity are there? So my little town is Shickley, 341 people. They have a community foundation, and we'll talk about this a little bit. But it has invested in the community for lots of things. But one of the things is it provides childcare, early childhood childcare. They have about 20 students, little kids enrolled in this in 2017. But it was the foundation that helped make that possible. And that community foundation, that's all money from the community, being invested in the community. But we'll talk about why it works, because it's not just about financial capital, it's about other things. And that's a picture of a little grocery store that's back home, town of 341 people, is keeping a grocery going. And but they've been innovative and adaptive on how they're doing it. So, investing in that child care center, yes, there was money. There was money that came from the community. So people who had been generous with estates, or people who just donate and so on. So there was money. So that's financial capital. And financial capital is important. I'm not saying it isn't. But how do you get a community foundation?
Volunteers.
What?
Volunteers.
Volunteers. People have an idea. And they go and say, hey, let's do this community foundation. And so it is the relationships, the bonds between Joe Kemmler, who worked for the bank for a long time and who's now a local business person, but he's 2 years ahead of me in class, and back home in that particular area, his brother farms up there, and it is Rich Walder, who was the insurance agent in town, who said, yeah, this is a good idea, let's talk to these other folks. And they said, we can form this community foundation, this is a good idea. That's called social capital. Because they bridged out to other people outside the community, kind of got the idea, got the knowledge of how to make this work, but they had bonding capital within our community. They could make things go. Now that social capital is absolutely critical. Communities that have high amounts of social capital, trust, bonding relationships, bridging relationships, they make things happen. So this is just one of the things that we want to talk about, and we have to think about in terms of what's right with Kansas. I like that idea. What's right with Kansas and what's going on. Because a lot of times there is a lot of social capital in these places. We just need to tap into it. There's political capital, which, the rest of the nation is like, what happened in Kansas? But there's a lot of interesting networks and participation in the political process and in how that political process will divide up resources and so on. There's cultural capital. Kansas has a lot of immigrants and a lot of immigrants into these rural places. That's important. That can be cultural capital, but it can also be long-term knowledge of that particular place is also cultural capital. And then we think about human capital. Kansas has a long history of investing in education. I know that you had some issues the last decade, but still, you had a good investment in education. The Plains, in general, have done better on education investments, I think, than other places. So that human capital is really important. You just don't want to export it, right? We want to keep it. And then natural capital is absolutely critical. And we want to think about how we're going to protect our soil. I always say I never took a soil science course. I tried to get out of it at the University of Nebraska, and I was successful. I worked in labs instead. And what do I spend all my time on in classes with students is soil. Soil. You've got to take soils. You better know about soils. So that natural capital is absolutely critical. So this is different ways of thinking about what makes a community livable, what makes a community wealthy. Because this is about comprehensive wealth creation. This is not just about how much money is in my portfolio, how much money is tied up in that land and those land prices. This is about the people, the relationships, the beauty of the land, the what kinds of built capital like roads and transportation, these kinds of things. This has to be measured. And nobody measures it. We don't measure it on the national level very well. We don't measure it on the global level. I mean, think about it. We talk about the developed countries and GDP and the developing countries and GDP. We don't talk about happiness scales. And happiness scales might be actually more important than GDP. So we have to think about this comprehensive wealth creation. Now, the community capitals, that's a framework that comes out of the sociologists. The comprehensive wealth creation comes out of the economists, but we're all talking about the same thing. We're talking about broader ideas of well-being, broader ideas of what makes a place wealthy. And we're talking about ownership. We're talking about control in these places. That's really important. We're talking about lasting livelihoods. And by the way, FAO uses rural wealth. They call it livelihoods, but they talk about the same thing. If you have higher resources, natural resources, social resource, social capital, natural capital, human capital, you're more immune to shocks, or you can recover from shocks a lot better. You're more resilient. So this capital is really crucial to think about and to measure. And wealth, people think it's your net worth. That's not. Wealth is simply put the sum total of the assets we own as a society. And when you look globally, our economic model of prioritizing financial wealth has compromised other wealth creation on multiple scales. Now think about what's happened to China. Think about their rapid development progress has lifted, they've achieved some food security, they've achieved some things, but what has happened to their soil? What has happened to their water? Factories have polluted 20% of their soil. They're having to invest now into cleaning up heavy metals. So we can't just think about GDP because it's a very, very, very short-term kind of thing. So let's go through some of these. How am I doing on time? Okay, I'm going to go through these pretty quick so we can have a discussion, okay? So when we think about human capital, we're really thinking about the physical health, mental wellness of the skills, the competencies of a region's people. And we need to measure that. Because this is why nobody talks about comprehensive wealth, because we don't want to measure it. Yet we know that even companies on a traditional economic development model are looking to invest in places where people have skills and education and competency, right? We know that because all of these capitals interact. So we have to think about human capital and the mental well-being. This is particularly important in our society today. The mental well-being. And places that are smaller, that are community-oriented, often capture some of those problems early on. But think about, can we increase the number of food and farm businesses employing new and innovative techniques in terms of like maybe intermediated markets, new kinds of products? Can those things help improve the health outcome for a particular population? You know, what are some of the indicators of human capital? We need to think about those. And these are just a start. You guys need to think about this back home and think about it in terms of your community's leadership. Think about it in terms of the state legislature leadership. Where are we going to make investments? Because we need to think about measuring this so we can make investments so that we can increase our comprehensive wealth. Social capital, I talked about that, bridging and bonding, but it's really the stock of trust, relationships, and networks. And these networks that can be mobilized for action. Now this, by the way, is hard to measure. I'll say that as a sociologist, we've been thinking about this for a long time. However, you should try. And you should think about what are those networks. So if we're thinking about investments that actually increase partners in a particular project or in a particular way, that's actually an investment in social capital. If we think about increasing the diversity, so we make sure that people who may not always been involved, it can't be the same old, same old. We need to think about the different kinds of economic sectors represented, the demographic diversity. These kinds of things are really important in thinking about the diversity of partners. Increase the number of volunteers. Somebody talked about volunteers. There's a lot of different ways to measure, to think about measuring this. But social capital is also one of those things, you know the communities that have it because you can kind of see they get a lot of things done. But that doesn't mean that they just have it and this community doesn't have it. There are reasons why it's different. And there are ways to make investments and also to strategies to increase it. Okay? Opportunities and spaces for interaction among diverse stakeholders is absolutely critical. We're getting ready to start a program called Missouri Eats through University of Missouri Extension. It's based on the FEAST model out of the Oregon Food Bank, and it's really community organizing around food and helping people think about their food system, who has access, who doesn't, what could be improved, all these kinds of things, and creating community plans. And guess how we're going to measure it? We're going to measure it based on the capitals. And this is a breakthrough. We are going to use the community capitals, the comprehensive wealth framework, to measure our impact. And so you can see like social capital, when farms are banding together collectively, so cooperatives have historically been a strong form of social capital, really important source of social capital in the food and agricultural arena. There we go, Marlon. I got a picture of Douglas County up there. But the food policy councils, and what do you have, 45 of them? Is that right? And 35? But there's I know that Marlon Bates has some materials back here that about harvesting opportunity, but also to use these, yes. And then there's some materials on economic development strategies using this kind of model of comprehensive wealth. Natural capital, we don't spend enough time thinking about this, and this is going to bite us soon. And we have a lot of ecological economists working on this, but we've got to just pay attention to the natural capital. So the health of our soil, water, all of these things, natural beauty, biodiversity. All of these things are really incredible. And we can do it on farm. There's on-farm monitoring of diversity. There's a lot of toolkits, including from land stewardship projects. But we can do it in a region. But we have to pay attention to this. So what happens when we don't? Look at what happened in Iowa. So Des Moines sued the farmers because they said, hey, you're putting too much nitrogen in the water and it's costing us too much to clean it up. That's a natural capital issue. And nobody think now it only becomes apparent when it's a problem that you can measure in financial terms. Well, that is not what we want. We want to be measuring this all the time and saying this is as important on our scorecard as GDP. Now, this takes fundamental shift in how you talk about things, how your political leadership talks about things. This is absolutely critical to just kind of reframe how we're thinking about this. And this is part of what's right with Kansas, right? That you're thinking about some of these things. Did I drive through the Flint Hills coming down here on 35? Yeah. And it was dark. And I'm really sad because I could just see like I was going through some interesting landscape and I couldn't see anything. And I'm going to go back over to southeast Kansas and then up, so I'm going to miss them again. So I guess my husband and I are going to have to come explore one of your amenities, right? Because everybody talks about the Flint Hills and how cool they are. Political capital, this is like the stock of goodwill, influence, and power. And power is absolutely critical. I'm a sociologist. I think about power a lot. And we have to take it at the grassroots level and develop it. And that's what we've been doing, but sometimes we slack off. We have to cultivate leadership. And so leadership programs that help people explore their places and understand what's going on are ways to increase your political capital, to make investments in political capital. This is all food system based. This comes from the National Association of Development Organizations. But we might think about how we could get policies together that prioritize, food system work that actually increases all of our capitals. That would be using our political capital that we create. And lest you think it can't be done, Michael Carolyn, who's a rural sociologist out at Colorado State, he did this really interesting study looking at people who shopped at farmers markets 1 year to the next, and they were relatively new shoppers at these farmers markets, and I think also he had a CSA list too. But they went there for the food because they wanted, food that was tasty, and that's a really big thing. People want food that's tasty, and then they get more than they bargained for. And what they get is like engagement in the civic arena. Maybe at first you come because you think the food's better for you. Before you know it, you find yourself curious. Pretty soon, you start caring more about things like sustainability than you might have before. So it's that participation. It works. It creates these civic attitudes in people. So the food system can be really important in that. And then that becomes part of our community capitals, right? Especially if people start to act on those ideas in the political arena. So these are really important outcomes of the food system. And finally, built capital. And I would argue that we need to make some investments in built capital, but we have to think about investments across all of these capitals, but aggregation and distribution points, perhaps technology platforms, things that can help us. One of the things that's going to help us in rural Kansas and rural Nebraska more than anything is getting broadband internet, right? This is important. And that's part of built capital. We need to have that to make these, to keep our our folks in these areas and to invest in that makes other things happen. So this built capital is important as well. In Columbia, we are, now granted it's a metro area, but we've had a long-term farmers market. But then we had a group that loved what KC, Center for Urban Ag, which is now Cultivate KC, was doing, and these young people decided to do this Columbia Center for Urban Agriculture. They're all like 30 years old right now, and they've been doing this for like 8-9 years, and made a lot of mistakes and brought a lot of energy and did incredible things, including mobilizing the town. Well, the farmers couldn't get this done, but this group could. So we're now building a covered farmers market and demonstration farm on the site of our old fairgrounds in the city of Columbia. $2.5 million, $3 million yet to raise, but $2.5 million has been raised. And the University of Missouri Health Center is investing in this. So these are ways to mobilize. Finally, I would say, as I said in the international literature, people who can deploy a number of strategies, have access to a number of these resources, natural, social, financial, human capital, so that can put those capitals together in a way, makes them resilient to shocks. And we better darn well be thinking about shocks, right? Have you guys had a normal farming season in the last 10 years? No. Nobody's had a normal farming season. My brother still has crops out. I went to Wisconsin on October 30th, and I saw lots of crops out. It's just been weird weather, right? And why is that? Because we are in something that we've never experienced before. And perhaps we developed agriculture in the Great Plains in a span of like one of the most temperate climates ever, 150 years of a very temperate climate, and then all of a sudden it goes haywire again, we got to figure it out. But we have to think, so building resilience is absolutely critical, and you've got to invest across the board in all of those capitals to make our food and farming systems resilient. And this is the capacity of the system to absorb shocks and bounce back. But we want to make sure that it bounces back in a way that preserves all of those capitals. So longer, specialized, centralized, consolidated supply chains are very, very vulnerable to tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, pandemics, and global trade, which is maybe a man-made disaster at this point. But all of these things. Have we heard anything about tornadoes and hurricanes? Oh, fires. I forgot about fires, right? And that's a huge thing. We don't have the same situation in Missouri. And I forget, I'm here in Kansas. And I know fires are a big issue too, right? So how are we going to be resilient to those things? And this comes courtesy of Scott Marlowe at Raffi in North Carolina. And he was talking about Hurricane Matthew in 2016, just devastated North Carolina. They had another catastrophe this year. But this little on-farm dairy was the first dairy back in business and had the first milk back on the shelves. Because it was grass-based, and they'd had USDA value-added producer grants to help them develop this, so that's a manifestation of investment, but also a political capital. They have this on-farm ice cream store and tourism, but theirs was the only bottled milk in the local stores for over a week because they were resilient. They could do it, and that's really important to think about. So I want to end there. The idea that the food system is dynamic, it's changing. How we participate in it is up to us to decide, and how we organize it to capture benefits is really critical. We want to capture those benefits in a way that creates comprehensive wealth for our communities, wherever they're at. So we are thinking about the ecological, the social, the nutritional, economic health of particular places, and we're thinking about that broad-based idea of wealth, all those different kinds of capitals. Anyway, thanks for having me here. I got a few minutes.